Chapter 9. The first snowfall came early in December. I remember how the world looked from our sitting room window as I dressed behind the stove that morning. The low sky was like a sheet of metal. The blonde cornfields had faded out into ghostliness at last. The little pond was frozen stiff under its stiff willow bushes. Big white flakes were whirling over everything and disappearing in the red grass. Beyond the pond, on the slope that climbed to the cornfield, there was, faintly marked in the grass, a great circle where the Indians used to ride. Jake and Otto were sure that when they galloped round that ring, the Indians tortured prisoners, bound to a stake in the center. But grandfather thought they merely ran races or trained horses there. Whenever one looked at this slope against the setting sun, the circle showed like a pattern in the grass, and this morning, when the first light spray of snow lay over it, it came out with a wonderful distinctness, like the strokes of Chinese white on canvas. The old figure stirred me as it had never done before, and seemed a good omen for the winter. As soon as the snow had packed hard, I began to drive about the country in a clumsy sleigh that Otto Fuchs made for me by fastening a wooden goods box on bobs. Fuchs had been apprenticed to a cabinet maker in the old country and was very handy with tools. He would have done a better job if I hadn't hurried him. My first trip was to the post office, and the next day I went over to take Willa and Antonia for a sleigh ride. It was a bright, cold day. I piled straw and buffalo robes into the box and took 2 hot bricks wrapped in old blankets. When I got to the Shimerdas, I did not go up to the house, but sat in my sleigh at the bottom of the draw and called. Antonia and Willa came running out, wearing little rabbit-skin hats their father had made for them. They had heard about my sledge from Ambrose and knew why I had come. They tumbled in beside me and we set off toward the north, along a road that happened to be broken. The sky was brilliantly blue, and the sunlight on the glittering white stretches of prairie was almost blinding. As Antonia said, the whole world was changed by the snow. We kept looking in vain for familiar landmarks. The deep arroyo through which Squaw Creek wound was now only a cleft between snowdrifts, very blue when one looked down into it. The treetops that had been gold all the autumn were dwarfed and twisted, as if they would never have any life in them again. The few little cedars, which were so dull and dingy before, now stood out a strong, dusky green. The wind had the burning taste of fresh snow. My throat and nostrils smarted as if someone had opened a hartshorn bottle. The cold stung, and at the same time delighted one. My horse's breath rose like steam, and whenever we stopped he smoked all over. The cornfields got back a little of their color under the dazzling light, and stood the palest possible gold in the sun and snow. All about us the snow was crusted in shallow terraces, with tracings like ripple marks at the edges, curly waves that were the actual impression of the stinging lash in the wind. The girls had on cotton dresses under the shawls. They kept shivering beneath the buffalo robes and hugging each other for warmth. But they were so glad to get away from their ugly cave and their mother's scolding that they begged me to go on and on as far as Russian Peter's house. The great fresh open, after the stupefying warmth indoors, made them behave like wild little things. They laughed and shouted and said they never wanted to go home again. Couldn't we settle down and live in Russian Peter's house? Willa asked. And couldn't I go to town and buy things for us to keep house with? All the way to Russian Peter's we were extravagantly happy, but when we turned back, it must have been about 4 o'clock, the east wind grew stronger and began to howl. The sun lost its heartening power, and the sky became gray and somber. I took off my long woolen comforter and wound it around Willa's throat. She got so cold that we made her hide her head under the buffalo robe. Antonia and I sat erect, but I held the reins clumsily, and my eyes were blinded by the wind a good deal of the time. It was growing dark when we got to their house, but I refused to go in with them and get warm. I knew my hands would ache terribly if I went near a fire. Yulka forgot to give me back my comforter, and I had to drive home directly against the wind. The next day I came down with an attack of quinsy, which kept me in the house for nearly 2 weeks. The basement kitchen seemed heavenly safe and warm in those days, like a tight little boat in a winter sea. The men were out in the fields all day husking corn, and when they came in at noon with long caps pulled down over their ears and their feet in red-lined overshoes, I used to think they were like Arctic explorers. In the afternoons, when grandmother sat upstairs darning or making husking gloves, I read The Swiss Family Robinson aloud to her, and I felt that the Swiss family had no advantages over us in the way of an adventurous life. I was convinced that man's strongest antagonist is the cold. I admired the cheerful zest with which grandmother went about keeping us warm and comfortable and well-fed. She often reminded me, when she was preparing for the return of the hungry men, that this country was not like Virginia, and that here a cook had, as she said, very little to do with. On Sunday she gave us as much chicken as we could eat, and on the other days we had ham or bacon or sausage meat. She baked either pies or cake for us every day, unless, for a change, she made my favorite pudding, striped with currants and boiled in a bag. Next to getting warm and keeping warm, dinner and supper were the most interesting things we had to think about. Our lives centered around warmth and food and the return of the men at nightfall. I used to wonder, when they came in tired from the fields, their feet numb and their hands cracked and sore, how they could do all the chores so conscientiously, feed and water and bed the horses, milk the cows, and look after the pigs. When the supper was over, it took them a long while to get the cold out of their bones. While grandmother and I washed the dishes and grandfather read his paper upstairs, Jake and Otto sat on the long bench behind the stove, easing their inside boots or rubbing mutton tallow into their cracked hands. Every Saturday night we popped corn or made taffy, and Otto Fuchs used to sing, "For I am a cowboy and know I've done wrong," or "Bury me not on the lone prairie." He had a good baritone voice and always led the singing when we went to church services at the sod schoolhouse. I can still see those two men sitting on the bench, Otto's close-clipped head and Jake's shaggy hair slicked flat in front by a wet comb. I can see the sag of their tired shoulders against the whitewashed wall. What good fellows they were, how much they knew, and how many things they had kept faith with. Fuchs had been a cowboy, a stage driver, a bartender, a miner. He had wandered all over the great western country and done hard work everywhere, though, as grandmother said, he had nothing to show for it. Jake was duller than Otto. He could scarcely read, wrote even his name with difficulty, and he had a violent temper which sometimes made him behave like a crazy man, tore him all to pieces, and actually made him ill. But he was so soft-hearted that anyone could impose upon him. If he, as he said, forgot himself, and swore before grandmother, he went about depressed and shamefaced all day. They were both of them jovial about the cold and winter and the heat and summer, always ready to work overtime and to meet emergencies. It was a matter of pride with them not to spare themselves. Yet they were the sort of men who never get on, somehow, or do anything but work hard for $1 or $2 a day. On those bitter starlit nights, as we sat around the old stove that fed us and warmed us and kept us cheerful, we could hear the coyotes howling down by the corrals, and their hungry, wintry cry used to remind the boys of wonderful animal stories about gray wolves and bears in the Rockies, wildcats and panthers in the Virginia mountains. Sometimes Fuchs could be persuaded to talk about the outlaws and desperate characters he had known. I remember one funny story about himself that made grandmother, who was working her bread on the breadboard, laugh until she wiped her eyes with her bare arm, her hands being floury. It was like this. When Otto left Austria to come to America, he was asked by one of his relatives to look after a woman who was crossing on the same boat to join her husband in Chicago. The woman started off with 2 children, but it was clear that her family might grow larger on the journey. Fuchs said he got on fine with the kids and liked the mother, though she played a sorry trick on him. In mid-ocean, she proceeded to have not one baby, but 3. This event made Fuchs the object of undeserved notoriety since he was traveling with her. The steerage stewardess was indignant with him. The doctor regarded him with suspicion. The first cabin passengers, who made up a purse for the woman, took an embarrassing interest in Otto and often inquired of him about his charge. When the triplets were taken ashore at New York, he had, as he said, to carry some of them. The trip to Chicago was even worse than the ocean voyage. On the train, it was very difficult to get milk for the babies and to keep their bottles clean. The mother did her best, but no woman, out of her natural resources, could feed 3 babies. The husband, in Chicago, was working in a furniture factory for modest wages, and when he met his family at the station, he was rather crushed by the size of it. He, too, seemed to consider Fuchs in some fashion to blame. "I was sure glad," Otto concluded, "that he didn't take his hard feeling out on that poor woman, but he had a sullen eye for me, all right. Now, did you ever hear of a young feller's having such hard luck, Mrs. Burton?" Grandmother told him she was sure the Lord had remembered these things to his credit, and had helped him out of many a scrape when he didn't realize that he was being protected by Providence. Chapter 10. For several weeks after my sleigh ride, we heard nothing from the Shimerdas. My sore throat kept me indoors, and Grandmother had a cold which made the housework heavy for her. When Sunday came, she was glad to have a day of rest. One night at supper, Fuchs told us he had seen Mr. Shimerda out hunting. "He's made himself a rabbit-skin cap, Jim, and a rabbit-skin collar that he buttons on outside his coat. They ain't got but one overcoat among 'em over there, and they take turns wearing it. They seem awful scared of cold and stick in that hole like a bank of badgers." "All but the crazy boy," Jake put in. "He never wears the coat. Craddock says he's terrible strong and can stand anything. I guess rabbits must be getting scarce in this locality. Ambrose come along by the cornfield yesterday where I was at work and showed me 3 prairie dogs he'd shot. He asked me if they was good to eat. I spit and made a face and took on to scare him, but he just looked like he was smarter'n me and put him back in his sack and walked off." Grandmother looked up in alarm and spoke to Grandfather. "Josiah, you don't suppose Craddock would let them poor creatures eat prairie dogs, do you?" "You had better go over and see our neighbors tomorrow, Emmeline," he replied gravely. Fuchs put in a cheerful word and said prairie dogs were clean beasts and ought to be good for food, but their family connections were against them. I asked what he meant, and he grinned and said they belonged to the rat family. When I went downstairs in the morning, I found Grandmother and Jake packing a hamper basket in the kitchen. "Now, Jake," Grandmother was saying, "if you can find that old rooster that got his comb froze, just give his neck a twist and we'll take him along. There's no good reason why Mrs. Shimerda couldn't have got hens from her neighbors last fall and had a hen house going by now. I reckon she was confused and didn't know where to begin. I've come strange to a new country myself, but I never forgot hens are a good thing to have, no matter what you don't have." "Just as you say, ma'am," said Jake, "but I hate to think of Craddock getting a leg of that old rooster." He tramped out through the long cellar and dropped the heavy door behind him. After breakfast, Grandmother and Jake and I bundled ourselves up and climbed into the cold front wagon seat. As we approached the Shimerdas, we heard the frosty whine of the pump and saw Antonia, her head tied up and her cotton dress blown about her, throwing all her weight on the pump handle as it went up and down. She heard our wagon, looked back over her shoulder, and catching up her pail of water, started at a run for the hole in the bank. Jake helped Grandmother to the ground, saying he would bring the provisions up after he had blanketed his horses. We went slowly up the icy path toward the door sunk in the draw side. Blue puffs of smoke came from the stovepipe that stuck out through the grass and snow, but the wind whisked them roughly away. Mrs. Shimerda opened the door before we knocked and seized Grandmother's hands. She did not say how do as usual, but at once began to cry, talking very fast in her own language, pointing to her feet which were tied up in rags, and looking about accusingly at everyone. The old man was sitting on a stump behind the stove, crouching over as if he were trying to hide from us. Yulka was on the floor at his feet, her kitten in her lap. She peeped out at me and smiled, but, glancing up at her mother, hid again. Antonia was washing pans and dishes in a dark corner. The crazy boy lay under the only window, stretched on a gunny sack stuffed with straw. As soon as we entered, he threw a grain sack over the crack at the bottom of the door. The air in the cave was stifling, and it was very dark, too. A lighted lantern hung over the stove, threw out a feeble yellow glimmer. Mrs. Shimerda snatched off the covers of 2 barrels behind the door and made us look into them. In one there were some potatoes that had been frozen and were rotting. In the other was a little pile of flour. Grandmother murmured something in embarrassment, but the Bohemian woman laughed scornfully, a kind of whinny laugh, and catching up an empty coffee pot from the shelf, shook it at us with a look positively vindictive. Grandmother went on talking in her polite Virginia way, not admitting their stark need or her own remissness, until Jake arrived with the hamper, as if in direct answer to Mrs. Shimerda's reproaches. Then the poor woman broke down. She dropped on the floor beside her crazy son, hid her face on her knees, and sat crying bitterly. Grandmother paid no heed to her, but called Antonia to come and help empty the basket. Tony left her corner reluctantly. I had never seen her crushed like this before. "You not mind my poor mamenka, Mrs. Burton. She is so sad," she whispered, as she wiped her wet hands on her skirt and took the things Grandmother handed her. The crazy boy, seeing the food, began to make soft, gurgling noises and stroked his stomach. Jake came in again, this time with a sack of potatoes. Grandmother looked about in perplexity. "Haven't you got any sort of cave or cellar outside, Antonia? This is no place to keep vegetables. How did you get your potatoes frozen?" "We get from Mr. Bushy at the post office what he throw out. We got no potatoes, Mrs. Burton," Tony admitted mournfully. When Jake went out, Marek crawled along the floor and stuffed up the door crack again. Then, quietly as a shadow, Mr. Shimerda came out from behind the stove. He stood, brushing his hand over his smooth, gray hair, as if he were trying to clear away a fog about his head. He was clean and neat as usual, with his green neckcloth and his coral pin. He took Grandmother's arm and led her behind the stove to the back of the room. In the rear wall was another little cave, a round hole, not much bigger than an oil barrel, scooped out in the black earth. When I got up on one of the stools and peered into it, I saw some quilts and a pile of straw. The old man held the lantern. "Yulka," he said in a low, despairing voice. "Yulka, my Antonia." Grandmother drew back. "You mean they sleep in there? Your girls?" He bowed his head. Tony slipped under his arm. "It is very cold on floor, and this is warm like the badger hole. I like for sleep there," she insisted eagerly. "My mamenka have nice bed, with pillows from our own geese in Bohemia. See, Jim?" She pointed to the narrow bunk which Krajek had built against the wall for himself before the Shimerdas came. Grandmother sighed. "Sure enough, where would you sleep, dear? I don't doubt you're warm there. You'll have a better house after a while, Antonia, and you will forget these hard times." Mr. Shimerda made Grandmother sit down on the only chair and pointed his wife to a stool beside her. Standing before them with his hand on Antonia's shoulder, he talked in a low tone, and his daughter translated. He wanted us to know that they were not beggars in the old country. He made good wages, and his family were respected there. He left Bohemia with more than $1,000 in savings after their passage money was paid. He had in some way lost on exchange in New York, and the railway fare to Nebraska was more than they had expected. By the time they paid Krajek for the land and bought his horses and oxen and some old farm machinery, they had very little money left. He wished Grandmother to know, however, that he still had some money. If they could get through until spring came, they would buy a cow and chickens and plant a garden, and would then do very well. Ambrose and Antonia were both old enough to work in the fields, and they were willing to work, but the snow and the bitter weather had disheartened them all. Antonia explained that her father meant to build a new house for them in the spring. He and Ambrose had already split the logs for it, but the logs were all buried in the snow along a creek where they had been felled. While grandmother encouraged and gave them advice, I sat down on the floor with Yulka and let her show me her kitten. Marek slid cautiously toward us and began to exhibit his webbed fingers. I knew he wanted to make his queer noises for me, to bark like a dog or whinny like a horse, but he did not dare in the presence of his elders. Marek was always trying to be agreeable, poor fellow, as if he had it on his mind that he must make up for his deficiencies. Mrs. Shimerda grew more calm and reasonable before our visit was over, and while Antonia translated, put in a word now and then on her own account. The woman had a quick ear, and caught up phrases whenever she heard English spoken. As we rose to go, she opened her wooden chest and brought out a bag made of bed ticking, about as long as a flour sack and half as wide, stuffed full of something. At sight of it, the crazy boy began to smack his lips. When Mrs. Shimerda opened the bag and stirred the contents with her hand, it gave out a salty, earthy smell, very pungent, even among the other odors of the cave. She measured a teacupful, tied it up in a bit of sacking, and presented it ceremoniously to my grandmother. "For cook," she announced. "Little now, be very much when cook," spreading out her hands as if to indicate that the pint would swell to a gallon. "Very good. You have no in this country. All things for eat better in my country." "Maybe so, Mrs. Shimerda," grandmother said dryly. "I can't say but I prefer our bread to yours myself." Antonia undertook to explain. "This very good, Mrs. Burton." She clasped her hands as if she could not express how good. "It make very much when you cook, like what my mamma say. Cook with rabbit, cook with chicken, in the gravy. Oh, so good." All the way home, grandmother and Jake talked about how easily good Christian people could forget they were their brother's keepers. "I will say, Jake, some of our brothers and sisters are hard to keep. Where's a body to begin with these people? They're wanting in everything, and most of all in horse sense. Nobody can give 'em that, I guess. Jimmy here is about as able to take over a homestead as they are. Do you reckon that boy Ambrose has any real push in him?" "He's a worker, all right, ma'am, and he's got some catch-on about him, but he's a mean un. Folks can be mean enough to get on in this world, and then again, they can be too mean." That night, while grandmother was getting supper, we opened the package Mrs. Shimerda had given her. It was full of little brown chips that looked like the shavings of some root. They were as light as feathers, and the most noticeable thing about them was their penetrating, earthy odor. We could not determine whether they were animal or vegetable. "They might be dried meat from some queer beast, Jim. They ain't dried fish, and they never grew on stalk or vine. I'm afraid of 'em. Anyhow, I shouldn't want to eat anything that had been shut up for months with old clothes and goose pillows." She threw the package into the stove, but I bit off a corner of one of the chips I held in my hand and chewed it tentatively. I never forgot the strange taste, though it was many years before I knew that those little brown shavings, which the Shimerdas had brought so far and treasured so jealously, were dried mushrooms. They had been gathered, probably, in some deep Bohemian forest. Chapter 11. During the week before Christmas, Jake was the most important person of our household, for he was to go to town and do all our Christmas shopping. But on the 21st of December, the snow began to fall. The flakes came down so thickly that from the sitting-room windows I could not see beyond the windmill. Its frame looked dim and gray, unsubstantial, like a shadow. The snow did not stop falling all day, or during the night that followed. The cold was not severe, but the storm was quiet and restless. The men could not go farther than the barns and corral. They sat about on the house most of the day as if it were Sunday, greasing their boots, mending their suspenders, plaiting whiplashes. On the morning of the 22nd, Grandfather announced at breakfast that it would be impossible to go to Black Hawk for Christmas purchases. Jake was sure he could get through on horseback and bring home our things in saddlebags, but Grandfather told him the roads would be obliterated and a newcomer in the country would be lost 10 times over. Anyway, he would never allow one of his horses to be put to such a strain. We decided to have a country Christmas without any help from town. I had wanted to get some picture books for Yulka and Antonia. Even Yulka was able to read a little now. Grandmother took me into the ice-cold storeroom where she had some bolts of gingham and sheeting. She cut squares of cotton cloth and we sewed them together into a book. We bound it between pasteboards, which I covered with brilliant calico, representing scenes from a circus. For 2 days I sat at the dining room table, pasting this book full of pictures for Yulka. We had files of those good old family magazines which used to publish colored lithographs of popular paintings, and I was allowed to use some of these. I took Napoleon announcing the divorce to Josephine for my frontispiece. On the white pages I grouped Sunday school cards and advertising cards which I had brought from my old country. Fuchs got out the old candle molds and made tallow candles. Grandmother hunted up her fancy cake cutters and baked gingerbread men and roosters, which we decorated with burnt sugar and red cinnamon drops. On the day before Christmas, Jake packed the things we were sending to the Shimerdas in his saddlebags and set off on Grandfather's gray gelding. When he mounted his horse at the door, I saw that he had a hatchet slung to his belt, and he gave Grandmother a meaning look which told me he was planning a surprise for me. That afternoon, I watched long and eagerly from the sitting room window. At last I saw a dark spot moving on the west hill, beside the half-buried cornfield, where the sky was taking on a coppery flush from the sun that did not quite break through. I put on my cap and ran out to meet Jake. When I got to the pond, I could see that he was bringing in a little cedar tree across his pommel. He used to help my father cut Christmas trees for me in Virginia, and he had not forgotten how much I liked them. By the time we had placed the cold, fresh-smelling little tree in a corner of the sitting room, it was already Christmas Eve. After supper, we all gathered there, and even Grandfather, reading his paper by the table, looked up with friendly interest now and then. The cedar was about 5 feet high and very shapely. We hung it with the gingerbread animals, strings of popcorn, and bits of candle, which Fuchs had fitted into pasteboard sockets. Its real splendors, however, came from the most unlikely place in the world, from Otto's cowboy trunk. I had never seen anything in that trunk but old boots and spurs and pistols, and a fascinating mix of yellow leather thongs, cartridges, and shoemaker's wax. From under the lining he now produced a collection of brilliantly colored paper figures, several inches high and stiff enough to stand alone. They had been sent to him year after year by his old mother in Austria. There was a bleeding heart and tufts of paper lace. There were the 3 kings, gorgeously apparelled, and the ox and the ass and the shepherds. There was the baby in the manger and a group of angels singing. There were camels and leopards, held by the black slaves of the 3 kings. Our tree became the talking tree of the fairy tale. Legends and stories nestled like birds in its branches. Grandmother said it reminded her of the tree of knowledge. We put sheets of cotton wool under it for a snowfield, and Jake's pocket mirror for a frozen lake. I can see them now, exactly as they looked, working about the table in the lamplight. Jake with his heavy features so rudely molded that his face seemed somehow unfinished. Otto with his half ear and the savage scar that made his upper lip curl so ferociously under his twisted mustache. As I remembered them, what unprotected faces they were. Their roughness and violence made them defenseless. These boys had no practiced manner behind which they could retreat and hold people at a distance. They had only their hard fists to batter at the world with. Otto was already one of those drifting, caste-hardened laborers who would never marry or have children of their own. Yet he was so fond of children. Chapter 12. On Christmas morning, when I got down to the kitchen, the men were just coming in from their breakfast chores. The horses and pigs always had their breakfast before we did. Jake and Otto shouted, "Merry Christmas!" to me, and winked at each other when they saw the waffle irons on the stove. Grandfather came down, wearing a white shirt and his Sunday coat. Morning prayers were longer than usual. He read the chapters from St. Matthew about the birth of Christ, and as we listened, it all seemed like something that had happened lately and near at hand. In his prayer, he thanked the Lord for the first Christmas and for all that it had meant to the world ever since. He gave thanks for our food and comfort and prayed for the poor and destitute in great cities where the struggle for life was harder than it was here with us. Grandfather's prayers were often very interesting. He had the gift of simple and moving expression. Because he talked so little, his words had a peculiar force. They were not worn dull from constant use. His prayers reflected what he was thinking about at the time, and it was chiefly through them that we got to know his feelings and his views about things. After we sat down to our waffles and sausage, Jake told us how pleased the Shimerdas had been with their presents. Even Ambrose was friendly and went to the creek with him to cut the Christmas tree. It was a soft, gray day outside, with heavy clouds working across the sky and occasional squalls of snow. There were always odd jobs to be done about the barn on holidays, and the men were busy until afternoon. Then Jake and I played dominoes, while Otto wrote a long letter home to his mother. He always wrote to her on Christmas Day, he said, no matter where he was, and no matter how long it had been since his last letter. All afternoon he sat in the dining room. He would write for a while, then sit idle, his clenched fists lying on the table, his eyes following the pattern of the oilcloth. He spoke and wrote his own language so seldom that it came to him awkwardly. His effort to remember entirely absorbed him. At about 4 o'clock, a visitor appeared, Mr. Shimerda, wearing his rabbit skin cap and collar, and new mittens his wife had knitted. He had come to thank us for the presents and for all grandmother's kindness to his family. Jake and Otto joined us from the basement, and we sat about the stove, enjoying the deepening gray of the winter afternoon and the atmosphere of comfort and security in my grandfather's house. This feeling seemed completely to take possession of Mr. Shimerda. I suppose in the crowded clutter of the cave, the old man had come to believe that peace and order had vanished from the earth, or existed only in the old world he had left so far behind. He sat still and passive, his head resting against the back of the wooden rocking chair, his hands relaxed upon the arms. His face had a look of weariness and pleasure, like that of sick people when they feel relief from pain. Grandmother insisted on his drinking a glass of Virginia apple brandy after his long walk in the cold, and when a faint flush came up in his cheeks, his features might have been cut out of a shell, they were so transparent. He said almost nothing and smiled rarely, but as he rested there we all had a sense of his utter content. As it grew dark, I asked whether I might light the Christmas tree before the lamp was brought. When the candle ends sent up their conical yellow flames, all the colored figures from Austria stood out clear and full of meaning against the green boughs. Mr. Shimerda rose, crossed himself, and quietly knelt down before the tree, his head sunk forward. His long body formed a letter S. I saw grandmother look apprehensively at grandfather. He was rather narrow in religious matters and sometimes spoke out and hurt people's feelings. There had been nothing strange about the tree before, but now, with someone kneeling before it, images, candles, grandfather merely put his fingertips to his brow and bowed his venerable head, thus Protestantizing the atmosphere. We persuaded our guest to stay for supper with us. He needed little urging. As we sat down to the table, it occurred to me that he liked to look at us, and that our faces were open books to him. When his deep-seeing eyes rested on me, I felt as if he were looking far ahead into the future for me, down the road I would have to travel. At 9 o'clock, Mr. Shimerda lighted one of our lanterns and put on his overcoat and fur collar. He stood in the little entry hall, the lantern and his fur cap under his arm, shaking hands with us. When he took grandmother's hand, he bent over it as he always did and said slowly, "Good woman." He made the sign of the cross over me, put on his cap, and went off in the dark. As we turned back to the sitting room, grandfather looked at me searchingly. "The prayers of all good people are good," he said quietly.